Hello, welcome to the Pub Scholar. Today we're going to look at the theories of aging from a historical to a modern overview. So for the theories of aging, we're going to look at three different aspects. One of that is the historical theories of aging and just some of the people who were involved in these theories and what they thought of it. Next, we'll look at why we age. So when I say why we age, this is looking at it from a evolutionary perspective. So we're going to look at different animals and why there are such great different lifespans between different animals and what are the commonalities of that. Then we also look at how we age. So this is going to refer to more of the biochemical reasoning of it, the actual science drilled down to the processes in our bodies that cause us to age. And how some of the theories have aligned with that. So we're going to start with Aristotle and his thoughts on how we age or why we age. So basically his thought was dehydration. And that may sound a little simple to us right now, but there was a logic to it. Many of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans would be familiar with grapes. And as these grapes dried out, they would turn into raisins. Now, the human body does something sort of similar, at least from a superficial standpoint. As we get older, our skin does actually dry out somewhat, and we do wrinkle. Now, there are different reasons why we wrinkle, not just that we lose moisture, but certainly losing moisture is a real thing. It does happen to humans. Of course, there are many different elements involved in aging. Now, some of the reasons why we lose this moisture is due to a loss of a acid called hyaluronic acid. This is a acid that holds water very well. And as we lose it, we actually lose that water, and that plays a role in our wrinkles. And of course, there are other things involved like collagen that breaks down and elastin and so forth. But Aristotle was onto something. For the next theory of aging, we're going to look at the wear and tear theory. This theory was proposed by Dr. August Weismann in 1882. And this is basically when you age as an accumulation of just damage and wear and tear and everyday use and stressors on the body. So this is sort of the intuitive approach that many people might think about in the 19th century. And you can make this analogy to like a pair of pants or your shirt or your boots, that as you use it, your shirt will break down, the fabric will stretch, the boots will kind of rip a little bit in certain places. And this is a pretty intuitive thing to say. And this became really sort of famous as a kind of common sense approach to the theory of aging around this time. Now, there are some shortcomings to this theory. One of the biggest shortcomings is that it kind of underappreciates the ability for the body to repair itself. When you compare the body to a shirt or to a sort of a dead object, it doesn't give enough credence to how the body really works fully. Now, on some level, wear and tear does affect us, obviously, and it does ultimately cause damage, but that wear and tear is done through the repair mechanisms rather than just the tissue itself, because the body can actually repair many of its tissues. And certainly if you look throughout the entire animal kingdom, there are many animals that have the ability to do incredible amounts of repair. For our next historical theory of aging, we're going to look at the rate of aging theory. So this theory was proposed by Max Rubner in 1908. And basically its key observations were that smaller animals had faster metabolisms, which in turn, they had shorter lifespans. And inversely, larger animals had slower metabolisms but had longer lifespans. And the proposed mechanism for this was that the faster the metabolic rate, the more free radicals our body would make, or the body would make. So the free radical production was at a fixed rate. And this also showed that there was a relationship between the basal metabolic rate and body weight. So, in other words, the higher the metabolism per pound, the more free radicals there were. So we can see this graph that as animals get bigger, they have a longer lifespan. So there is definitely a relationship between the size of the animal and the lifespan of that animal. There are definitely some exceptions to this rule. For example, birds and bats live much longer than you would expect for their size. And they also have the same metabolic rate as mammals of their same size. So what this would imply is that evolution has already found a way to solve the rate of aging. That you can have a high type of metabolism and quote unquote have more free radicals, or maybe not, I don't know, it depends on the case of bats and birds, but you could still find other ways of living longer. So there are other ways of determining, there are other factors involved in determining the full lifespan of these species. Next, we'll look at why we age and why there's such a great difference between different animals and their lifespans. For example, a Greenland shark can live up to 300 years, while a brown antechinus mouse lives less than 1 year. In fact, some insects live less than a day. And there are trees that are over 5,000 years old. So there are still debates raging on this, but we'll look at some of the reasoning and some of the theories that are behind this such great diversity of lifespans. So for our first theory, we'll look at what's called the programmed aging theory. And this theory basically states that aging has an evolutionary advantage. Aging is explicitly programmed into our genes. Aging would be in fact good for our species. Some of the proposed reasons for this is population control, and other reasons would include things like genetic diversity, so that the younger populations would have more of a mixture of genes. So this would also imply things of how this aging actually works in our bodies, that we actually have active genes that are slowly killing us. And here's a little chart I have. There are challenges to this program theory of aging. One of the challenges is that death is not a great way to control population size. When you actually look at the mathematics, the biggest factor for the population size will be birth rate and not death rate, generally speaking. Another factor is that, caring for elderly parents is a drain on resources. Instead of investing in more children, if you have to help out really old parents with their problems or elderly grandparents, that's resources being taken away from the parents that could have been given to the children. Historically also, most people didn't reach old age. It was pretty rare to make it to your 60s, 70s, and 80s. There were cases, but generally speaking, people on average didn't reach that age. And lastly, there hasn't been a lot of genes that have shown to be kind of just pro-aging. There are genes that may age you, quote unquote age you, but those tend to be things like testosterone that are related to fertility and but not necessarily related to just getting older. So in high doses, yes, that's bad for you, but generally speaking, there isn't any genes that we have found that are simply aging genes that cause you to actually age yet. Maybe they exist, but they haven't been found yet. So here's a graph that shows the population growth rate when you include death as a factor. So the blue line is where there is death, but there is a fertility rate of 4. While the green line represents where there is no death. No one is dying of aging in this theoretical line, but the fertility rate is only 2.5. So you can see that even with a death rate, the growth of a population can happen very fast if the fertility rate is high enough. Another theory of aging is a theory I like to call the selection shadow. So this is a theory introduced by J.B.S. Haldane in 1941. It proposed that aging evolves because the force of natural selection declines with age, a concept known as the selection shadow. What this theory states or implies is that the odds of you dying as a healthy adult will control or will influence how long you would live. This is because as your odds go up of dying early, there's no reason for evolution to try to invest in you living longer. And in many cases, the speed of reproduction can make up for the benefit of a longer lifespan. In this case, there's not really a point for evolution to help you live longer if the probability of you being killed by this elephant running at you is very high, or you're going to be cannibalized by the other tribe next door. The goal for evolution is that you reproduce better, not necessarily live longer. So if the trade-off is that you can breed faster, in many cases, evolution will take that route and will not necessarily invest in a longer lifespan. This may be one of the reasons why flying animals tend to live longer, because non-aging related mortality is lower than a terrestrial animal. So, in conclusion, the shadow selection theory is probably the most favorable theory when it comes to scientists. So most scientists would say, on average, that is the sort of favorite theory. That's the theory that most scientists would actually go with. I would say that program aging of theory, that's kind of a lot of people in the media, a lot of people in general will go with that theory. They would say that aging is natural, and which is true, it's natural, but they would also say that it's sort of programmed, that it has sort of a purpose. So I think implicitly a lot of people do go with the programmed theory of aging, whether they would put it in those terms or not. So the science isn't really fully settled, and generally speaking, but I think that when you look at it in close detail, it's the shadow selection theory that is the most popular among scientists, while the program theory is more popular among the laymen. Okay, switching over. Now we're going to look at how we age, and we're going to get into the more mechanisms of aging. So this is not a full list of all the theories of aging. These are just some of the things, some of the theories that we will look at. So some of these theories include the damage accumulation theory. This is from the SINS Foundation via Aubrey de Grey. And we also have the hallmarks of aging, which is pretty similar to that theory. And another theory, we have the information theory of aging, aka epigenetic noise, proposed by Dr. David Sinclair. And there's also broadly the theory of aging from a entropy standpoint. An example of someone who favors that theory would be Vadim Gladishov. And so these are three different theories that are common. Certainly there are other theories. And these theories don't necessarily exclude each other. So just because some elements of one theory could be right doesn't mean that the other elements are wrong. So we'll look at them and we'll see what they imply and how they can give rise to certain therapies or inspire certain therapies. Next, we'll look at the damage accumulation theory of aging. This theory was championed by Aubrey de Grey in 2003. So this theory states that aging happens by a progressive buildup of the side effects of normal metabolism. Our evolutionary pressure is too weak for this late-acting, slow damage accumulation. The SINS that we hear about stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. This theory especially went more mainstream and was more sort of validated back in 2003 in a paper called The Hallmarks of Aging. This theory is somewhat similar to the wear and tear theory of aging, but it does a good job at looking at the actual mechanisms, the actual damages that accumulate as we age. Because many of the damages that inflict our body as we get older, just throughout our healthy life, our body can actually repair quite well. But these damages are the ones that actually accumulate, that our body doesn't handle very well. So that really does separate this theory more generally from the wear and tear theory of aging. Here are the 7 deadly things, quote unquote, of aging and their fixes. On the left, we see the damage type in that column. So these are the damages that happen in broad terms. And on the right, we see a maintenance approach or ways of fixing them. I think the motivation that separates these categories is the therapies to address them. So if one therapy can address multiple kinds of the issue of this type, then that can be its own sort of class, its own category. So for example, when you see cell loss or cell atrophy, then the strategy would simply to use stem cells. And in the case of the death-resistant cells, then the strategy would be to use suicide genes in order to take out those cells. So that's the general inspiration of this. Here you can see the Hallmarks of Aging that was released in 2013. So this was sort of inspired by the 7 Deadly Sins by the Sins Foundation. Although there are differences, I think perhaps a big one is the epigenetic alterations that was used. These are alterations that were later to be found in the information theory of aging. Another theory of aging is the information theory of aging. This was a theory popularized by Dr. David Sinclair in 2019. What this theory states is that aging is driven by the epigenetic loss of information. So cells will lose their specialized identity over time through epigenetic damage. In this case, you can think of aging as more like, quote unquote, scratches on a DVD than a irreversible type of damage. In other words, the core information, the actual DNA sequence, is not being lost. It's just the tags around that information, the epigenetic data, that is getting scrambled. And this can actually be reversed through certain kinds of reprogramming or partial reprogramming. Here's a graphic that shows the difference between the loss of epigenetic information and the loss of genetic information. Dr. David Sinclair uses methylation of the genome as a proxy for epigenetic aging. So there are other important chemical modifications of the genome. These modifications are basically chemical tags that are around the genome. So we have DNA that are kind of bundled up in these chromatin packages. And these DNA have these chemical tags. And these chemical tags will cause the chromatin to take various shapes. And these tags are things like acetylation, which tends to activate them, has tags called phosphorylation, and there's other ones as well. But you can think of these tags as kind of different charges or partial charges that cause these genes to activate or deactivate. And in layman's terms, and more broadly speaking, we can think of this as the histone code, and that determines how genes get expressed. Because in biology, every cell has the entire DNA inside of it. But every cell can act very differently. And this difference is because of the epigenome. It is these chemical tags that cause a skin cell to behave very differently than a neuron cell or a muscle cell. And as we age, we can think of this sort of distortion of these chemical signals accumulating. And this distortion will cause the epigenome, the chromatin, to sort of change form. And thus the chemical availability of it will change. And thus the aging phenotype may exist. Here is a chromosome, and you can see that it breaks down into smaller elements. And this graphic does a good job of just kind of breaking it down and showing, starting from the high level chromosome and kind of zooming into smaller levels of details where you see the histones and the histone tells. And it even tries to show you some of the tags like the methyl group and so forth. So what you're seeing here is a graphic of the histones. So histones are protein balls that the DNA will wrap around. Right now, these histones would be like H2B, that's one histone, and they have these histone tails that are attached to them. So you see this, what these histone tails have these little small balls that say S, R, K, R, R, K, T, and those are just amino acids. So there's a shortcut like S, and the amino acid stands for serine, which is one of the 20 different basic building blocks of amino acids. But as you look closer to these little balls, you see even smaller little balls called P or ME at the bottom. And we see that they're sort of attached to these amino acids. So this is what I was referring to as the chemical tags. So we're going to compare and contrast some of these theories. The damage accumulation theory versus the information loss theory. So Dr. Aubrey de Grey may, or at least that theory, may assume that these damages would cause the epigenetic drift, or the changes in the epigenetic genome that we see. While Dr. David Sinclair would say that these epigenetic changes would actually drive aging and create some of the damages. So the question really is, what is the primary driver? What is causing which? And how do we understand, like what experiments would we do to prove which theory is the primary 80-20 here? Because it's unlikely that either theory is totally right. There probably are some elements of damages that accumulate even if our epigenome was pretty much perfect. And vice versa. If we totally took away every kinds of aging damage, it's hard to not to imagine that some of these changes are totally for the good. So the question is that which strategy would some of these theories actually invoke? And what experiments would we do to see what is the primary strategy here? So these are some experiments that we could in theory do. We could add a form of damage to a epigenetically young cell. So in theory, if we could take some of the damages we see in some of the cells of the external environment and put young cells in that environment, aka young epigenetic cells, and then introduce some of the late stage damage we see, and we can see which conquers which. Could the young epigenetic cells take care of the older damage? And another thing is that we could take a epigenetic DH cell to see if damage is cleaned up. So we could take an old cell and epigenetically rewind it through a process called partial reprogramming and see how it handles the damage that's around it or inside of it. And there's other things that we could experiment with. We could treat the damage accumulation of an old cell and then track the epigenetic changes. So if we can identify cells that have quite a bit of epigenetic damage that's accumulating, how is the epigenetic responding to those changes? And what is the sort of time differences? Does a cell epigenetically get older and then the damage accumulates, or vice versa? And of course, we could also just keep a epigenetic cell young and then track the aging damage that accumulates. So these are different forms of experiments that we could, in theory, do to kind of see which is the primary driver. So another theory of aging is the entropy-related theory of aging. So this takes a much more broader form of aging. It's not just about fixing a certain amount of damages. It's not just about the information theory of aging, but entropy affects many things. It kind of affects everything. And it's a more general process. And in this process, aging starts very early on. It starts right away because entropy starts right away. Aging is systematic and complex. The distribution of the damages, the distribution of the disorder is very broad. So many treatments for it will not ultimately work out very well. And so there are some aspects of aging that can be treated, but it's just very difficult to actually treat. One of the champions of this idea is Vadim Gladishov from Harvard. I think he has more of a physics standpoint, and he uses that for his theory of aging, which is entropy-based. So looking at all three of these theories, we see that entropy is a broader concept, and it sort of encompasses both of them. It encompasses the information theory of aging, and it also encompasses the damage-related theory of aging. And this theory is technically, it's right. I mean, I think on some level, entropy is such a broad concept that it probably has the fundamental cause of aging. I think one of the maybe downsides of this theory is that it's so broad that it's not as useful in a sense of it would actually inspire therapies to use, to actually make therapies. And however, one of the emphasis that this kind of thinking may lead you to is focusing on replacement rather than repair. Replacement can properly export the accumulation of entropy that happens over time. So instead of just trying to maybe have a new enzyme that will repair a cell, just get new cells, for example, that can be grown in an external fashion. And here's a graphic that shows entropy. These are two different kinds of entropy that are shown here. On the top, we have entropy without damage accumulation or loss, which is very common in the Aubrey-de-Grey form of aging, or theory of aging. And on the bottom, we have entropy with damage accumulation or loss. So we see that entropy is a broader concept than just damage or loss. Or it can also be a broader concept than the information loss at the epigenetic level. So on the top, we see a mixture of these two red balls and green balls, while on the bottom, we see maybe a mixture, but more of a damage that's accumulating and some losses happening. So both cases are entropy, but one is another form of entropy that I think isn't talked about as much as some other kinds. So here I'm making the point that a theory can be very accurate, technically speaking. It can be accurate, but sometimes it's accurate because it's very broad. And the value of a theory isn't just how accurate it is, it's also how actionable is it. So for our cases, when we're looking at aging, we want a theory to give us a sense of what are the fundamental causes of it and what are the actionable steps that we can take. So one could argue that that actually the damage accumulation and the information theory are a bit more actionable than the entropy theory of aging, even though the entropy theory of aging is probably more accurate in total, because there are elements of the damage accumulation theory of aging and the information theory of aging that aren't really talked about. One big one, I think, is the genetic mutation accumulation, not just the epigenetic changes, but there are over time some genetic mutations that accumulate over a human's lifespan. So I don't think those theories are totally encompassing. They may be more actionable though, so there's kind of a pros and cons there. Now, there are other theories of aging that's not talked about in this presentation. I'm just giving some of the sort of top three ones, or two or three very high ranked ones. Certainly, there are other ones that are out there that are worthy of talking about. We just have limitations of time and so forth. But some of these examples of these other theories could be the telomere theory of aging. This is championed by a Dr. Bill Andrews. And there's other interesting kind of off-topic or maybe slightly off-topic, but not fully off-topic, like the bioelectric theory of aging. This is championed by Dr. Michael Levin. And so in the future, we might talk more about these theories and go into them and so forth and what they might mean for therapies. But in a nutshell, these are some of the thoughts on the theories of aging, and I expect there to be more interesting ideas as we go through and new ideas to pop up.